I still remember the morning the first violation letter showed up because, honestly, nobody thought it was actually serious. Around here, we'd always joked that if your grass wasn't tall enough to hide a Labrador and your mailbox was still standing, the HOA usually left you alone. That had been the rhythm of our neighborhood for years. Quiet mornings, people waving while walking their dogs, kids riding bikes until the streetlights came on, and every evening, right around 6, a white utility bucket truck would rumble into the same driveway at the end of Ashford Lane. It belonged to a guy I'll call Ryan Mercer. Ryan wasn't loud, wasn't political, wasn't the kind of neighbor who showed up at HOA meetings ready for a fight. He was one of those hard-working utility linemen everyone depended on after storms rolled through. When the power went out, Ryan was usually one of the first people climbing into that truck before sunrise. The company required him to take it home every night because emergency calls could happen any time, and the truck was too tall to fit inside a garage anyway. For over a decade, nobody cared. Even the previous management companies looked at it, shrugged, and moved on because everyone understood the difference between someone showing off a commercial vehicle and someone simply trying to do his job. Then everything changed when the HOA hired a new property management company. You could almost feel the difference within the first month. Suddenly, there were inspection cars driving through the subdivision every afternoon, stopping every few houses like they were gathering evidence for a crime documentary. People started finding bright orange violation notices tucked under their doors. One family got warned because their trash can stayed by the curb until dinner. Another because weeds had grown between two sidewalk cracks. Someone else received a notice over a basketball hoop that had been sitting in the exact same place for 7 years. At first, most of us laughed. We figured the new managers were just trying to make a good impression, proving they were earning their contract. "Give it a month," my neighbor Tom said while we stood outside watching his sprinkler run. "They'll calm down." They didn't. If anything, they got bolder. Then one afternoon, Ryan walked out to his mailbox, opened an envelope, and just stood there staring at it. I happened to be trimming a hedge across the street, so I wandered over. "Everything all right?" I asked. He handed me the letter without saying a word. According to the HOA, his utility truck violated the rule against commercial vehicles being parked overnight in residential driveways. He had 10 days to remove it or begin paying daily fines. I remember looking at him and saying, "They're kidding, right?" He gave me this tired little smile that somehow looked more exhausted than angry. I wish they were. The strange thing was Ryan didn't even try to argue emotionally. He wasn't asking for sympathy. He explained the situation exactly the way he'd probably explained it 100 times before. His employer wouldn't let him leave the truck at the yard because he needed to respond to emergencies. He couldn't park it in his garage because it physically wouldn't fit. He didn't own another vehicle because the company truck was his transportation. It wasn't a luxury. It wasn't a hobby. It was literally part of his job. So he filed an appeal with the HOA, believing common sense would eventually win. During the hearing, one board member barely looked up from her paperwork before saying, "We appreciate your service, Mr. Mercer, but the rules apply equally to everyone." Ryan calmly replied, "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking you to recognize that this truck has been here for over 10 years without causing a single complaint." Another board member leaned back in his chair and answered with a sentence that would eventually cost them far more than they ever imagined. "If we make one exception, everyone will want one." That was it. Appeal denied. Fine upheld. Ryan came home that evening looking defeated, but something about his expression changed over the next couple of days. The frustration slowly disappeared and was replaced by something much quieter: curiosity. Instead of arguing with people, he started reading. Every evening after work, he'd sit on his front porch with a binder full of HOA documents, township ordinances, and neighborhood covenanters spread across a folding table. His wife joked that he'd spent more time with legal paperwork that week than with television. One evening, I walked over carrying 2 cold beers and asked, "Find anything interesting?" Ryan smiled for the first time in days. He tapped one paragraph with his finger, looked up at me, and said softly, I think they only read half their own rules. Then he slid the binder across the table. The covenant clearly prohibited commercial vehicles from remaining overnight in driveways. But there was one thing it never mentioned: the public street running directly in front of every house. It wasn't an oversight most people would have noticed. But Ryan wasn't most people anymore. He'd stopped trying to win an argument. Now he was trying to understand exactly where the HOA's authority ended and where the law actually began. The next evening, just before sunset, every curtain on our street quietly shifted as neighbors watched Ryan climb into his bucket truck, back it out of the driveway, and park it directly along the curb in front of his own house. The next morning, Ryan expected another violation letter. Honestly, so did the rest of us. Instead, he found something much more interesting. Nothing. No bright orange notice. No warning taped to his front door. No email from the management company. The truck sat exactly where he'd left it, parked legally along the public street. And for the first time since this whole mess had started, he looked almost amused. They're trying to figure out if they can still scare me. He told me while we stood outside drinking coffee before work. They're probably hoping I move it on my own. 2 days later, the notice finally arrived. It wasn't for parking in the driveway anymore. Now they claimed his commercial vehicle was creating an eyesore that negatively affected neighborhood appearance. Ryan actually laughed when he read it, the kind of laugh that comes from someone who already knows the ending while everyone else is still reading chapter 1. They changed the reason, he said, shaking his head. That's usually not a good sign. Instead of arguing with the board again, he drove over to the township offices during his lunch break. He wasn't looking for sympathy. He wasn't looking for someone to fight his battle. He simply asked one question: who controls parking on the streets inside Brookhaven Estates? The woman behind the counter smiled politely, pulled up a map, and pointed to a highlighted section. These roads were dedicated to the township years ago. They're public streets. Ryan asked another question. Can a homeowners association regulate vehicles parked on public streets? She didn't even hesitate. Not unless the township gives them that authority, and ours never has. Would you mind putting that in writing? She looked up, smiled again, and said, happens more often than you'd think. By the time he walked back out carrying an official letter with the township seal across the top, the entire situation had shifted. This wasn't one homeowner arguing with an HOA anymore. This was the local government explaining exactly where the HOA's authority stopped. Ryan hand-delivered the letter to the property management office the following afternoon. The community manager, a woman I'll call Melissa, glanced at it, then read it again more slowly. We'll have our attorney review this, she said, trying to sound confident. Ryan simply nodded. Please do. Then he turned around and walked out without another word. That calmness bothered them more than any shouting ever could have. People who know they're right usually don't need to raise their voices. A week later, the violation quietly disappeared from his account. No apology. No admission they were wrong. Just gone. Most people would have celebrated, parked back in the driveway somehow, and moved on with life. Ryan almost did exactly that. Then one Saturday morning, while scrolling through the neighborhood Facebook group, he saw another homeowner asking if anyone knew whether the HOA could really control parking on public streets. Ryan stared at the screen for a minute. He thought about deleting the draft he'd started typing. His wife, Emily, noticed him sitting silently at the kitchen table. What are you thinking? She asked. Ryan shrugged. If I tell everyone what I learned, this neighborhood is going to get interesting. Emily raised an eyebrow. Interesting good, or interesting expensive, he grinned. Probably both. That afternoon he wrote a long, respectful post explaining everything. He uploaded a picture of the township letter. He quoted the exact covenant language. He explained the difference between driveway restrictions and public streets. He never insulted the board, never called anyone names. He simply laid out the facts and finished with one sentence. If you're being fined for legally parking on a public street, you may want to verify whether the HOA actually has that authority. By dinner, hundreds of comments had appeared. Some people thanked him. Others admitted they'd paid fines for years because they assumed the HOA was telling the truth. A retired firefighter commented that he'd been renting storage space for his service trailer every month out of fear of violations. A contractor admitted he'd been driving 20 extra minutes every evening just to park his work van somewhere outside the subdivision. Then came the comment nobody expected. A long-haul truck driver named Derek wrote, "Hold on, if Ryan can park his utility truck legally, then my tractor cab should be legal too." 3 nights later, Derek's bright blue semi-tractor was sitting proudly in front of his own house. It wasn't blocking traffic. It wasn't breaking any township ordinance. It was simply there. The neighborhood exploded. Some people thought it was hilarious. Others hated the look of it. The HOA absolutely panicked. Before they could react, another resident rolled his 30-foot RV out of storage and parked it along the curb. 2 days later, a fishing guide brought home his bass boat on its trailer. Then a landscaping company owner parked 3 commercial pickups in front of different family members' homes. It was almost comical how quickly the street transformed. Driving through Brookhaven suddenly felt like passing to a trade show. Bucket trucks, utility vans, RVs, boats, landscaping trailers. One old military surplus Jeep that hadn't seen daylight in years somehow appeared like it had been waiting for this exact moment. Nobody coordinated it. Nobody organized a protest. There were no meetings, no petitions, no secret Facebook group planning revenge. It happened because dozens of homeowners independently realized they'd spent years following rules that had never actually existed. Every evening, people walked outside just to see what new vehicle had appeared. Kids started naming them. The giant boat's back. The blue truck moved. There's another camper today. Even people who didn't own oversized vehicles found themselves secretly rooting for the growing collection because everyone understood this wasn't really about parking anymore. It was about whether intimidation should replace common sense. The management company tried everything. They sent warning emails that carefully avoided mentioning legal authority. They encouraged residents to be good neighbors. They hinted that future amendments might solve the issue. None of it worked. Every morning, more vehicles appeared. During the next HOA board meeting, the clubhouse was packed beyond capacity. Ryan sat quietly in the back beside Emily. Derek folded his arms near the entrance. Homeowners filled every chair and lined the walls. Melissa stood at the front with several board members, her smile noticeably thinner than usual. "This situation is negatively affecting property values," one board member announced. A voice from the audience answered immediately. "Which law are we breaking?" Silence. Another homeowner stood up. "If the streets belong to the township, why were people fined?" Another pause. Then an older gentleman asked, "Will everyone who already paid those fines receive refunds?" You could almost hear the air leave the room. The board members looked toward Melissa. Melissa looked toward the association attorney. The attorney adjusted his glasses and quietly leaned toward the president. Whatever he whispered changed everything. The president cleared his throat before speaking again. "After consulting legal counsel, the board is willing to consider revisions to the parking policy." A woman near the front couldn't help herself. "You mean because you finally realized you can't enforce the old one?" A ripple of laughter spread through the room. Even people trying to stay serious couldn't hide their smiles. Ryan never said a word. He simply sat there watching the same people who had once told him, "Rules are rules," now searching desperately for a graceful way to admit they'd misunderstood the limits of their own authority. Sometimes silence is the loudest victory of all, and Ryan understood that better than anyone. But none of us realized the biggest surprise was still waiting just around the corner. Because once the HOA admitted defeat, the neighborhood itself had to decide whether winning the argument was more important than preserving the community we'd all chosen to call home. The following week, something happened that I honestly never expected. The streets started emptying, not because anyone had lost the argument, and not because the HOA suddenly found new authority they didn't have before. They emptied because the point had already been made. The contractor drove his work trucks back to the equipment yard. Derek hauled his blue tractor cab back to the freight terminal. The fishing guy took his bass boat to storage before sunrise. One by one, every oversized vehicle disappeared until Ashford Lane looked exactly the way it had before this whole thing started. Only this time, everybody understood why. A month later, the HOA announced a proposed amendment to the parking rules. Instead of pretending commercial vehicles were automatically forbidden everywhere, the new language allowed certain work vehicles under specific size limits to remain in residential driveways, provided they were well maintained and didn't block sidewalks or neighboring property. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was something the board could actually enforce without pretending public streets belonged to them. During the community vote, even some of the homeowners who had been furious about seeing RVs and trucks lining the curb voted in favor of the change. One older woman stood up and said something I'll probably never forget. "I don't particularly like looking at work trucks," she admitted, "but I like people keeping their jobs even more." Nobody applauded. Nobody needed to. Sometimes the quiet moments carry more weight than the loud ones. Ryan went back to parking his bucket truck in his own driveway that very evening, exactly where it had sat peacefully for more than 10 years before this unnecessary fight ever started. As I watched him back it in, I realized nothing about the truck had changed. The neighborhood hadn't changed either. What had changed was the way people looked at authority. Before all this, most of us assumed every letter with an HOA logo automatically meant someone had checked the law first. We believed because it was easier than asking questions. Ryan never set out to embarrass anyone. He never wanted to become some neighborhood hero. If you'd asked him from the beginning what he wanted, his answer would have been painfully simple. "I just want to park my truck after work and eat dinner with my family." That's it. Everything that followed happened because someone decided enforcing power was more important than using common sense. A few weeks after the vote, I ran into Melissa, the property manager, outside the clubhouse. She looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with long work hours. We exchanged an awkward smile before she finally sighed and said, "This neighborhood has certainly been educational." I couldn't help smiling. "For everybody, I think," she nodded slowly. "You know, we came in believing consistency meant enforcing every rule exactly the same way." I looked down the street where Ryan's white bucket truck was sitting quietly in his driveway, almost invisible now that nobody considered it controversial anymore. "Maybe," I said, "consistency starts with making sure you're actually enforcing the rules you have, not the ones you wish you had." She didn't argue. She just stood there for a second before quietly saying, "Fair enough." Looking back now, that's probably my favorite part of the entire story. Nobody got dragged into court. Nobody lost their home. Nobody had to declare victory with some dramatic speech. The biggest win came from one ordinary guy refusing to panic, refusing to yell, and refusing to assume the loudest voice in the room was automatically the right one. He simply opened a binder, read every page carefully, asked the right questions, and discovered that facts have a funny way of outlasting intimidation. Every time I see a utility truck now, I think about Ryan pulling away from his driveway that evening, parking along the public curb with half the neighborhood peeking through their blinds, wondering if he completely lost his mind. It turns out he hadn't. He'd simply found the one place where confidence always beats authority, the truth. So now, I want to hear from you. If you are living in that neighborhood, would you have joined everyone else and parked your RV, boat, or work truck on the street to make a point? Or would you have kept your head down and paid the fines just to avoid the conflict? And where do you think the line should be between protecting a neighborhood's appearance and respecting the rights of the people who actually live there? Share your thoughts in the comments because stories like this rarely have just one right answer. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who's ever had an HOA tell them. Rules are rules because sometimes the most satisfying victories don't come from breaking the rules. They come from reading them more carefully than anyone else.